Hey, I'm Brian. I'm a blacksmithing instructor, and this is a project for my Beginning Blacksmithing class. We're going to be making a heart hook, which is a gaudy but fairly common project to see in blacksmithing classes. There are easier ways to make a simple hook, but I like this project because it introduces the splitting process, and it illustrates the importance of order of operations. Now we'll start with a length of 1/4 by 3/4 mild steel flat bar. Those sizes don't really matter as long as the bar is wide enough and thick enough to split it with a chisel. Here I'll be using a cold chisel, but we're always working at heat, so a hot chisel would be fine too. Notice that if I lay the bar down this way, it's radiating heat into my chisel hand. By flipping the bar around, my hand is further from the bar and picks up less heat. You could also just wear a glove on your chisel hand or hold the chisel in a pair of tongs. I'm going to cut about 2.5 inches of the bar, though the length of that cut also doesn't really matter. The longer the cut, the bigger the heart becomes at the end. Here I want to mark the stopping point of my cut, so I'll lean my chisel out and use the corner to establish an obvious end of the cut. If you don't do this, your cut sort of tapers out instead of stopping at a specific point, and I find it doesn't look as clean. Another option is to punch or drill a small hole beforehand and split the bar up to that hole. Now that my line's established, I'll strike harder and start making the cut deeper. Keep a close eye on how deep you're cutting, and don't hit too hard, especially while the steel is really hot. When the metal gets thin here, you can easily blow through it accidentally and mess up your chisel or your anvil face. Here I'm checking the depth of my cut by looking at the end of the bar. You can see there's still a little bit of material here, so I'm going to take another pass of light chiseling at the anvil face. Now at this point, there's only a tiny web of metal left, so I'm going to attempt to split this end open. I'm going to be using a sacrificial aluminum block for this, though a mild steel block or an anvil saddle would work just as well. I'm trying to get the very corner of my chisel on the thinnest part of that web and just start splitting it open at the very end. Now I think I see some light coming through it, so I'm going to hammer each branch in opposite directions to see if I can get them to separate. I'm not making much progress here, so I flatten it back out, and I'm going to take another pass with my chisel. Now back to the aluminum block to see if I can get this open anymore. Many anvils have a table, that step between the face of the anvil and the horn. This is conventionally used for backing up cuts like this, but I always recommend to people that you use a sacrificial block instead. The block works just as well, and it'll keep your anvil looking nicer. If nothing else, it improves the resale value. Alright, I've definitely got light coming through it this time, so I should be able to tear this the rest of the way at the anvil. I push one of the branches down to expose the side of it, and now I can hammer these apart. If your bar is short, you can actually stand this up over a cutting hardy to wedge open the cut, or just mount the bar in a vise and finish cutting it with a chisel. All these methods have their pros and cons, so you should try them all and see which works best for you. Now that we have these open, I'll put this in a vise and rasp off some of that rag material that's left behind from the cut. This isn't strictly necessary, but if we forge the branches as is, we could accidentally forge some of that rag material over and push it back into the surface of the bar. That would create cold shuts, which leave unsightly spots on our final surface. For some reason, I'm trying to rasp that top branch while it's not supported directly by the vise jaw, so of course it bends. I'll straighten it out, rotate the bar, and get that branch held in the vise jaws so I can finish rasping it. With that rag gone, I'll finish opening this up to the bottom of the cut. The material isn't tearing any further, so I need to do one more round with my chisel to thin out the remaining web of material. Then I can tear it down to the bottom of that cut. Now I'm going to straighten the branches out and position each at 45 degrees to the bar. This gives me clearance to draw out the branches on the anvil face. I like to hold the bar angled up like this, as it provides a good grip with my tongs and keeps the other branch pointed down and out of my way. We draw this taper like any other, starting at the far end and keeping it square the whole time we're drawing. Once it's drawn out, I work down the length with lighter blows to clean up the shape. We aren't aiming for a specific length here, just two nice gradual tapers that match one another. Now since this one looks good, I'll start drawing the other branch now. I'll also take light passes here with the heel of my hammer just to forge the branches right up to the end of that cut. I'm only lightly squaring the material here just to give it a nice transition. I stop when these look about the same length, but I can use a trick to get them even closer. I'll put the crotch of the cut on the near edge of the anvil with one branch laying across the anvil face. Now I lay my hammer down to mark where that branch reaches, and I can flip the bar back and forth, comparing each branch against that mark. These look even enough, but if they weren't, we could draw out the shorter branch or cut down the longer branch. Next, I'll round up these tapers by knocking down the corners to make a rough octagon, then rolling them under light hammer blows to round them up. Try not to work at a black heat here, as that very end of the taper can split if you work it too cold. Now I mentioned earlier that this is an exercise in order of operations, and here's a great example. Your intuition may tell you to finish the heart shape now, but if we did that, we wouldn't be able to easily hold the bar with tongs anymore. Instead, we're going to leave the branches as is until the very end and make the heart as the last step. The next step is to cut off the bar, leaving enough material behind so that we can draw a taper and then roll it up into a hook. Try estimating how much material you will need, taking into account the length that you're going to gain while drawing. In my case, I need about 3 or 4 inches. We could draw this all the way down to a straight taper, but since we have a good amount of width here, I like to include a little decorative tip, or finial. I hold the bar on its side and draw a taper in one direction at the end of the bar. Now notice here, I'm not turning it back and forth 90 degrees to keep it square. I'm letting it widen out as I squish just the end of the bar. I'll turn it 90 degrees, push the material past the edge of the anvil, and use a half-face blow to isolate a small bit of that widened material. This creates a little disc of metal at the very end. When we roll the hook, this little curved piece will become reminiscent of a pigtail or a scroll. Now that we've got that material isolated, I'll start drawing down the rest of the taper toward it, always making sure that that finial piece is hanging over the far edge of the anvil so I don't accidentally crush it. I use my crosspeen here to speed this up, and then my flat face to remove those crosspeen marks. Now I'm aiming for a taper only in one dimension. The width of the bar should go from wide to thinner at the very end. I want the bar's thickness, however, to not taper. I'm trying to keep it consistent at the original 1/4 inch thickness. Again, this is not necessary, it's just a design choice. Now that the taper is drawn out, I'll knock down the corners just to soften that shape up a little. Because this is a rectangle, I like to bounce back and forth between opposing corners. If you forge all the way down one corner of a rectangle, it's hard to keep the piece from twisting. Here I hang that decorative finial off the far edge so I can soften the corners without damaging it. To shape the finial, you can trap it against the side of the anvil. Here I'm just rounding it up and then putting a couple of flats in to give it an interesting shape. With the taper finished, it might seem like a good time to start rolling the hook, but that would then make it hard to punch a hole later. This is another case where the order of operations matters, but it's not very intuitive. I'll punch a small hole to fit a screw or a nail, about 1/8 of an inch in this case. As always, we punch one side against the anvil face, flip the piece over to find that dark shiny spot, and then punch the other side on the anvil face. And if necessary, move over the pritchel hole to clear the plug out. Now we can start rolling the hook. With the finial facing up, I'll start rolling this over the horn. If your finial is small or delicate, you'll want to quench it off first, but I didn't bother in this case. One thing to remember here is that you need to leave the hole accessible. If you bend the hook up in front of the hole, it'll be hard to actually get a screwdriver in there to attach it to a wall. Now I want to make sure that the hook is centered. Here I'll lean the bar one direction and then the other direction, working lightly down the entire hook. It's the same thing I would do if I were centering the taper while it was still straight. The last step is to flip this around and finally make that heart shape. I like to leave the branches relatively straight at the bottom and have it curve more as we get closer to the tip. I start by curving one tip, then the other, and I work back and forth, keeping them similar as they start to approach one another. The base of the heart here looks a little wide to me, so I come to the near edge of the anvil and lightly push the branches together. This is all aesthetic, so you can make it any shape you like. Now that the branches are almost touching, I'll stand this up on the anvil, or hold it in my tongs like this over the edge, and just use my cross peen to push the branches down the rest of the way. Of course, all this could be done with bending forks or scrolling tongs if you feel you have more control with those tools. That's it for the heart hook. All you need to do now is brush, wax, and mount it on a wall to add an air of sophistication to any space. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you here for additional projects.